got another name and word not only added to your vocabulary, the Masoretes, but hopefully understood and comprehended now. So we don't just throw terms around and you can't follow us and don't know what we're talking about. We said that this group of Jewish scribes, known as the Masoretes, were important for three reasons. They were important for the reason of standardization, for division, and for pointing. Now, do you remember what those three things meant? Because a few people were a little confused afterwards last week, so I just want to maybe go into it a little more and review it and put something up for you to see at least what the one of the pointing subjects was. Now, standardization, we'll come back to that in a moment. Divisions, that's the least of the three important things that would hold its own importance. We talked about the different paragraphs and the different sederim, how they had divided, in other words, their Bible. So you'd understand division. Pointing, we talked about the puncta extraordinaria, the special points. Did any of you go home and look up those passages and get it all figured out for us and determine why did they think there was a doctrinal problem? Well, I hope some of you, I hope you're not just coming here listening to me. You think about these things yourself. Go home and look the passages up and see if you can find out what it is. Well, I'm sure no one did, because at least no one figured it out. Hopefully some of you went home and looked it up. But it's a little difficult to see where they're going to have a doctrinal or maybe a textual problem. Maybe a textual problem would be more understandable if it was back in another manuscript. The other thing under pointing that we talked about was that peculiar insistence of theirs of turning the Hebrew in upside down on a couple of occasions, about 9 places in Numbers 10 and Psalm 107. We didn't suggest that anyone go home and figure that out because nobody knows why they turned it upside down, but it was just a particular pointing of theirs. Then we talked about punctuation. Then we talked about vocalization, all of this under pointing. And we said that the two most important things that they are known for would be the standardization of the text and the vocalization of the text. The standardization comes by itself. It doesn't go under divisions. It doesn't go under pointing. But the vocalization of the text was one of the things that we mentioned under pointing. Now, to make standard simply means to make everything in agreement and everything uniform. It's just the accepted thing if it's standard. Because some people were asking some questions about, what do you mean about standardization of the text? And this is very important. This is very important that you understand that, because all of our Bibles today are built upon the Masoretic text, which means they're built upon the standardized text. Now, if you say, well, that's no big thing, well, what if we went over into the New Testament and just took the standardized text, which would be the Byzantine text type, then we're going to end up with all types of problems, because that's where the King James Version is. So you could say, on one hand, standardization in the AD years for Christians doing the work was really not a very good thing after all. But standardization because it produced a standard Byzantine text type. But for the Old Testament, it's very, very important. That's why we don't see the variants in later manuscripts, because around 100 AD, working all the way through the 11th century AD, these Masoretes are working on looking at the manuscripts that are available and selecting the variants they think to be best. And it's really a process of weeding out. It's a process of elimination. What happened to all of the other possible alterations of some Old Testament texts? Well, most of them were simply weeded out by the Masoretes. They just took them out, which was a service as long as, and I don't guess we got so far as this, but it was a service as long as the variant they chose was the correct variant. Because they could have just weeded out all of the right variants, and every time they took a choice, it was always a wrong choice. And you say, well, can we do anything about that? Is there any way we can gain some hope or some confidence that what they did is right? Well, yes, we can, and we'll get to that later on. But that's what I mean by their importance in the area of standardization. They begin working. Remember, we gave you two periods for Old Testament texts, the Talmudic period and the Masoretic period. And although we started the Masoretic period around 500 A.D., we said really there was an overlapping between the last 500 years of the Talmudic period and what ended up being the first 500 years of the Masoretic period. So they start after the councils of Jamnia. We discussed that last week, the importance of the fall of Jerusalem, which helped to bring about a school of scholars down at Jamnia, which helped to bring about not only questions of the canonical status of certain books, but it opened the way, it paved the way to start dealing with the problem of standardization, of the problem of dealing with the manuscripts that were available, with the variants that they had, and finding out now which one is to be reliable, which one is to be counted on as being as near to the original as possible that we want to perpetuate in future manuscripts. So hopefully you understand something about standardization. Then we said the second most important thing that they were concerned in was vocalization, which comes under pointing, which, if you remember that the Hebrew alphabet's composed entirely of consonants, how are you going to pronounce consonants? How are you going to vocalize them? That's where we get the word vocalization. How are you going to pronounce the consonants if you don't have some vowels in there to help you? Put an M and a D and an H together in your language, and what do you get? Say the word. You get nothing. Can't even pronounce it. You can run a whole string of consonants together, a C and an S and a K and a V, and what do you get? Nothing. You can't pronounce the word. So it's very important that they not only offer to us their process of standardization, but vocalization as well. It receives the name pointing because of the little points that are made, or the little letters that are drawn. So you might want to be getting some of this down as we explain it. There were three different systems. There were basically two different schools of the Masoretes, those that were over in Babylon. Why'd they go to Babylon? Right. 2nd century A.D., Christianity had taken over Palestine. So this group of the Masoretes heads over to Babylon and founds a school there that lasts till around the 9th or the 10th century. And if anyone could be considered liberal among the two, the Babylonian group of the Masoretes would be a little more liberal than the group back in Palestine. But it's not the Palestinian group, it's the Tiberian group that became the famous group that produced some of the great names of the fathers of the Masoretes that did the work in the today accepted standardization of the text, as well as the vocalization, the pointing, the inserting of the vowels. But there was another system known as the Palestinian system, obviously done by others who weren't part of either the Babylonian or the Tiberian group. And it, like the Babylonian system, we said was a supralinear system, which meant that they, for the most part, gave the pointing over the vowel rather than underneath it. Now, this isn't anything that needs to be memorized because it's not the way Hebrew is today, although a lot of this is the same. There's a lot that you don't have here. You got the little dagesh in Hebrew that changes whole letters depending on where you put the little point, but it always goes inside. If you've got it inside, it makes it one letter. If you've got it outside, it makes another. So this isn't complete as far as what's being done today with the Hebrew writing, but this is the way it was done then. Now, the little lines represent where the letter would be, and here's an equivalent to the letter. This would be like a long A, a short A, an E, I, O, and U. Languages are fascinating to study because no matter where you go, no matter what you call them, you have to have vowels in order to pronounce it. And look which ones you have, A, E, I, O, U. Same ones we have to have. Why can't you just invent, someone just put some words together and come up with a new word and draw a different sign and make it a vowel? It's very remarkable how languages are. They're so similar throughout the world. There are a lot of basics that go along with languages, no matter what type of language it is. So let's skip this one for a moment, because that's really not a dot. That is the way they made it. But in other words, here's the letter. Now, we don't have the Babylonian letter drawn. We've got the English equivalent of it. But here would be, in other words, the level of the top of the letter. And so if you want to let us know that you've got a short A involved, then you put 2 dots over it. And you put them in that direction, the diagonal direction. Then an E, you've got them beside each other, and I is 1 dot, and O 2 dots, and then another little strange sign for the U. But in both cases, with the Babylonian and the Palestinian system, for the most part, you've got these points that are found over the top of the letter rather than underneath it or beside it or inside of it. And so the Palestinian system, again, it's superlinear. Superlinear simply means that it's above the line. The dots are above the line, or above what would be the level of the top of the letter. Long A, short A, and AE, which can give you a different sound, an E, and I, an O, a U. Now contrast, well, first of all, you can compare these two, and then contrast these two with the bottom, the Tiberian system. That's the one that's important. That's the one, by the way, that Hebrew today is founded upon. So a lot of it's going to be the same, or at least very similar. Why don't we move this up a little higher so you can see the bottom more clearly. Now, even Hebrew today has things that look like a little T that's crossed, which gives you a different vowel. We're not getting into right now, we're not ever going to get into, at least in textual criticism, because we don't deal with it here on how do you know if the A goes before or behind. Because all that tells you, this isn't an A. Remember, the A is not the letter. The A is the pointing. There are no letters for A, E, I, O, and U. There are only these points for that, or these little symbols. So this would be like, well, it could be an Aleph. That's really not a letter. Aleph's not an A, by the way, if any of you are confused about the first letter. It's just a certain symbol. The Hebrew alphabet really doesn't make up a letter distinctly as the others do. Aleph Beth is the second letter, so if you had a Beth here, this would be the letter Beth, or Gimel, or a Dalet, or a Hey, or a Nun, or a Mem, or whatever. But then in order to get the whole word pronounced, you've got to get that vowel in there somewhere. So what I'm saying is we're not talking about, if you've got Beth there, if you've got Gimel there, does this A go before or behind? That's another little thing that you have to learn. But anyway, what represents the A? Well, put whatever your letter is that you want to put that's part of the word and draw what looks like a little tiny T. Make it as small as you can, as long as people can understand it and comprehend it to be a little T. So that's a long A. A short A is just a dash. AE, you've got a triangle of points. It's pointing. Triangle of points underneath it. E, you've got 2 points beside each other. I1, U3 diagonally. And the O's a little different because you go to a superlinear dot, which puts it above the letter. So that's all we meant by pointing. Some of you are not fully understanding what we meant by the pointing. You see, if we want to write 10, we just say write T-A-N. They would write T-N. And then in order to get this short A, then they'd put this line, either under the T or under the N. And you wouldn't have a vowel. There'd be no vowel there. But you'd have one of these little points to let you know that's the letter that goes in there. You see, in other words, remember that we've said long ago, this has been almost 2 years ago, since we had a delay in this class back in the very beginning, that after the return from the exile, Hebrew began to pass off the scene as the common spoken language of the Israelites. They adopted Aramaic, which was the language of the whole empire at that time. So if it passes off the scene, and when you read it, you don't get to read the vowels, and what if you are a great-great-grandchild of someone? Then how do you read that? Oh, you might be able to know what those consonants are there, But there was no pointing in BC years. The Masoretes did this. How do you know what vowel to put in there if you're not used to reading the writing of the Hebrews? So it's very, very important that the Masoretes came along and gave this, since Hebrew as a spoken language was passing off the scene. That's one of the only ways it's been preserved down to this day, so that it can still be spoken without just making up our own system. That's what we'd have to do. And the Masoretes obviously could still speak it. They were Jewish scribes. That was part of their job and part of their religion, to be able to speak the language, the lip of Canaan, the language of the Jews, the language of their ancestors. That was very important for them. But back in the BC years, I mean, whenever Moses, for instance, is sitting down writing, he doesn't write any of these points. It's nothing but consonants throughout. It's just the way the language is written. Don't criticize things you don't understand. Just accept them as being not inferior, but different. Different doesn't make something inferior. There are a whole host of languages that are, well, they're quite a bit better than the English language. You say the word bear, and no one knows how to spell it or what type of bear you're talking about.
Amen.
And T, and we've got just a whole lot of words that you don't know what anyone's talking about. You don't know how to spell it unless you hear it in the context of what's being said. Which, by the way, is how the Hebrews would know what's going on. You hear the word, you read the word in the context of everything around it, and you can kind of tell what's being said there and what type of vowel should be put in on how to pronounce that particular word. So that's the vocalization, the pointing.
Is the Hebrew language compared to like today, is it real easy? Or is it like a hard language, like English is very hard today? Was it a hard language then?
You talking about it today or when?
Well, like the English language today is a hard language to learn.
Right.
During that time, was the Hebrew language hard to learn? You know, just without the vowels there.
No, it's not that difficult if you're raised in an environment like that. I mean, you can take a 3-month-old child and raise them with a nanny that speaks Italian, and you and your wife speak English, and he'll just learn perfect Italian and perfect English without even thinking about it, without even trying. But whenever you want to sit down, you know, you're 20 or 25 or 50 or 105 years old, and you decide, I'm going to learn this language, it's next to impossible to learn the language. Just a proven fact that during those early years of childhood, that's when the brain is most active and most receptive to these concrete ideas about language, and to be able to absorb them and not lose them later on. When you go to college and try to learn a language, it's difficult. Hebrew is a difficult language to learn. I mean, all of them are. There are just, you'd like to find a language where there are no exceptions to the rule, but there's hardly a language like that. There always are exceptions. I remember studying Greek in college. You'd have the rule memorized. If it's going to be like this, and this is always going to happen, except when this, or that happens. And you got to remember those 4 exceptions there. I mean, just one letter, the sigma, just for something small that maybe some of you have caught in some of the things we've written before, the sigma takes a different form depending on whether the sigma, that's the Greek S, is found somewhere in the middle of the word, begins the word, or ends the word. If it ends the word, it takes a different form. And depending on what case something's in, the dative case in Greek always changes the way things are spelled. So every time you hit a dative case, you have to know what the dative case is. Every time you hit a dative case, then you're going to be changing the spelling of that word. And it begins to look like a different word. Hebrew's like that. I was just brushing over some things myself in the Hebrew language, and it's just filled with exceptions. And just like the Dagish that we mentioned, whenever you put that inside of a letter, it's going to change the letter. It depends on where the letter is found, and a whole host of things like that. So it wasn't difficult as long as you weren't 30 years old trying to learn the language. Then it's going to be just as difficult then as it is today, unless you've got some type of background in that field.
I wasn't here last week, but is that 3 different languages? That's all Hebrew, what you're referring to there.
Right.
But different Palestinian and Siberian.
These were different, for the most part, different groups of Masoretes here. And these pointings refer to the vowels, since they had no consonants.
Right.
We were talking last week about these being superlinear because most of these points you see are found above the line. Superlinear means above. the Tiberian system, the Tiberian Masoretes were the most important ones. It's a sublinear because notice this AE compared to this AE, the dots are found, the points are found beneath the line. The other two systems it's found above. And this is what endured because this was never really a major group of the Masoretes, and this group passed off the scene in the 10th century AD.
Do we get our pronunciation of the tetragrammaton from pointing from the Masoretes?
I would say yes. It's a debated question, but I would say yes. As a matter of fact, I had that to cover last week, and I decided just to wait until we discuss maybe in theology or somewhere else the names of God. He's asking about the tetragrammaton. It really ties in very intimately with textual criticism and with the study of the Masoretes, but you have to go into an understanding of what the name means in the Hebrew, the YHWH. What is the meaning of the name? And so you get into that and you discuss some of the attributes of God. So you get into theology. So I had a whole thing to deal with that, give you a whole history of that and Jehovah and the whole bit. But I had it all ready, but I think we passed over it last week. We'll probably pass over it tonight as well. We'll get to it when we talk about the names of God, though. Okay, now one other thing that we talked about, down here at the very bottom, if you can see this, I just stuck this on to kind of show you. You might want to look up Judges 18:30, see how you've got it in your Bible. Maybe you want to write the Hebrew in, to be real technical and real precise. This was under the very last thing we were talking about, under pointing last week, when we talked about on certain letters, in certain places, for certain reasons, they'd write them in a peculiar way. One example we gave was the beginning of each book, they would enlarge the first letter of the first word of that book. But another famous change, or famous peculiar method of pointing, a little item of interest, concerns Judges 18:30. You remember the thing about Manasseh and Moses and all of that. We mentioned it at least 2 or 3 or 4 times. So here it is in Hebrew. And looky here, this letter's not supposed, this is the noon. Remember, it was MSH. And they stuck in that N, and stuck it in a little bit higher there, and eventually that worked itself right down into the text, and instead of Moses, you find the name Manasseh there. But I thought you might want to see how they had that arranged, which makes it a peculiar way of writing a letter. This is the noon. This is, of course, you're writing from right to left, so here's the M. This is Main, Noon, Sheen, Hey. And you shouldn't have this little noon in there, because by putting that noon in there, it gives you the word Manasseh instead of Moses. You should just have the M, the Main, Sheen, Hey, M-S-H. So that's what Judges 18:30 looked like until the noon just kind of worked itself right down into the text and just ends up as M-N-S-H, all on one line.
Right.
This might not have to do with what we're saying, but why do we say Moses instead of Moshe? Why do they
There's hardly a name in the Old Testament that's not, for the English person, mispronounced. Benjamin, Abraham, just about all of them are pronounced a different way in the Hebrew. And so to change one, we've mentioned this, I think, maybe way back in Old Testament. To change one means you have to change all of them. So there's no sense in even getting into it. And then who's going to know who you're talking about if you don't use Moses and Abraham and Adam and Eve, if you don't use those commonly accepted forms of the word?
Why were they translated so differently from the way they're originally pronounced?
A lot of misunderstanding by those that didn't know Hebrew. Remember, we talked about the Jews as being the custodians of the Old Testament because they were the only ones who knew the language. A lot of misunderstanding of the language. Because remember, Hebrew, people back in the 800s didn't say, let's go to school and study Hebrew. Nobody studied Hebrew. If you studied anything, it was either Latin or Greek. And those even passed off the scene until up in the Middle Ages, where people once again became interested in studying the classical languages. And the two classical languages of the Mediterranean world are Latin and Greek, and so people would go and study that. And so someone would get a smattering of Hebrew and then try to translate the Old Testament and really not know what they're doing. You know, an English translation, give us an English translation. And it would end up in different forms. We've talked about that a little before with the way that names like Isaiah and so forth are given to us over in the New Testament. Okay, if you're all settled on that, we want to just move on to an entirely different subject then tonight. In the year AD 217, it's been recorded of Origen that in order to make some notes on the Bible, he used a few old manuscripts that were found hidden near the ancient biblical city of Jericho in some jars. And then about 500 years later, in the 8th century AD, an Nestorian patriarch by the name of Timothy the First, it's recorded of him that he, at that time, was inquiring about some manuscripts hidden near the ancient biblical city of Jericho that supposedly were in a cave contained in jars that included 200 Psalms of King David. You remember the authorship of the book of Psalms when we studied Old Testament introduction? I don't remember specifically. Maybe someone just heard that tape today and can tell us, but it was something like 73 Psalms from the book of Psalms that, at least from the title, we know that David was the author of. And of course, there are some others that can be proven to be Davidic from the New Testament, as well as just a study of the anonymous psalm itself in the Old Testament. But even if all 150 of ours were written by David, look at this, 200 psalms by David. It's really not surprising. Solomon wrote 1,000 songs, 3,000 proverbs, and we just have a small number of those left today. It's interesting that in the 8th century, the 700s AD, this Nestorian patriarch, Timothy the First, was trying to get a hold of 200 psalms of David. I wonder what all those were saying. It'd be interesting to know. It'd be interesting for them to turn up sometime soon before we go.
Amen.
So, the caves in Palestine have always been turning up things. Perhaps nothing as great, though, as what we refer to as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is what we want to start looking at briefly tonight. The Dead Sea Scrolls. They were described by W.F. Albright, who at that time was probably the dean of archaeologists in the world, not just in this country. He was a professor of archaeology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. They were described by him as being the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. Now, when you have the reputation of someone like an Albright, William Foxwell Albright, and you pronounce such a great blessing over this discovery, then there must be something important about it. He said it was the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. This was said back in 1947. Here's part of a letter that he wrote to John Trevor when Trevor had sent him a few prints from the Isaiah scroll that had been discovered recently. Here's a part of what he had to say. My heartiest congratulations on the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. There is no doubt in my mind that the script is more archaic than that of the Nash Papyrus. I should prefer a date around 100 BC. What an absolutely incredible find. Scholars of Albright's eminence just don't make statements like that unless they mean what they're saying. They take their reputation in their own hands when they're known as the dean of archaeologists in the world of their day. And he says, as though a child is excited over a new toy, ending it with an exclamation point, what an absolutely incredible find. And there can happily not be the slightest doubt in the world about the genuineness of this manuscript. Well, that's a pretty big statement to be making. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are worthy of us spending a little time looking at them. That's a pretty big statement to be making. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are worthy of us spending a little time looking at them. You say, looking at them, do I have them? No, they're not in the trunk of the car. About the only thing I left out in the car was my Bible tonight, so I'm glad we're not preaching on a lot of facts back there in Habakkuk or a lot of verses. I'd have to have a Bible to look all of them up. But you can't look all these things up in your Bible, so praise the Lord. I guess it was a one night. It's all right to leave my Bible out in the car. Better know the Word if you leave it in the car, though. In case someone asks you a question. Well, I'll just borrow someone's on the front row if I don't know what verse you're talking about. It's good to know it. Oh, I had someone call, it brings to mind, someone called the other night and wanted to talk about something, give me some alleged proof text against divine healing. This individual asked me, did I have my Bible, and it was out in the car then, too. We had just gotten home from church that night. But anyway, I said, well, tell me what it is you want to know, and I'll try to answer your question, and if I can't answer it, then I'll go out there and get my Bible, but why waste my time to go out there and get it when probably I don't need it? So he said, well, according to John 6:10, Bible says such and such, and I said, no, that's not John 6:10, that's John 9:6. He didn't like that at all.
Hallelujah.
Well, anyway, so it's good I knew where that passage was. Well, how did I get off on that? Oh, I left my Bible out in the car. That's how I got off on it. Well, anyway, if I need someone, I'll call out. But no, I don't have the Dead Sea Scrolls with me, but I do have some pictures, and I'll bring a lot more next week. If we go long enough tonight, then we won't need it, but I think that we'll probably spend some more time looking at it next week. Let's look first of all at a history of the discovery. Then I want to look at just what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls at a later time. Probably all we'll get through tonight is just a history of the discovery of the most famous manuscripts that have ever been discovered in modern times, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yes, they're more important than Vaticanus, they're more important than Sinaiticus. They're the most important discovery of manuscripts of modern times. They're one of the greatest discoveries of any manuscript of any time. I guess we could put it that way. If you want to try to compare it to something else, they're just about the greatest discovery of any manuscript at any time. Because we're certainly not going to rate the lost history of the Constitution of Athens or something on par with the Word of God. So it has to be a discovery, at least as far as we're concerned, that relates to the Word. The Dead Sea Scrolls certainly do. Not all of them were biblical, of the fragments of manuscripts that were found, but of those that were, there's a lot of importance attached to them. You'll find one of three dates for the initial beginning of the discoveries, either 45, 46, or 47. Most of the time you'll find 47, sometimes 46, very, very rarely 45. 19, that is, 45, 46, 47. Not long after World War II ended. and not long before the founding of the sovereign state of Israel. So it came at a very crucial time in world history.
Hallelujah.
I think World War II must have ended in 45, 39 to 45. And the Jewish state founded in 48, so we've got the years just before those two very important events in world history where we've got the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's kind of a blessing that they weren't discovered in 39 or in 42 because the world's too caught up in World War and fighting the Germans and the Japanese to be concerned about some antiquated manuscript that had been discovered. And a lot happened, and I don't think I've got all of that to give tonight, maybe next week. A lot happened whenever all of the war and the violence broke out, whenever the British troops finally left Palestine in the spring of 1948. Then you do have some manuscripts that just disappear and didn't come on the scene again for another couple of decades after that before they were even seen or heard of again. It's because of all that went on there in 48 whenever British troops withdrew themselves according to the Charter of the United Nations and let the Arabs and the Jews go at one another's throat on who would be able to take and keep a hold of the ancient land of Palestine. So those 3 dates, I'm staying with the middle one. That way you'll be conservative. 45, hardly nobody believes that. About everybody believes 47, but these Ta'amira Bedouin people are just a little too sly for us to be able to date specifically when they found it, because they're not going to tell you. They're a pretty sly, wise group of people when it comes to these manuscripts and discovering them and kind of covering their tracks behind them. So we'll start with 46. In 1946, 3 members of the Ta'amira Bedouin tribe. Bedouins were, well, there are 3 different types of Bedouins, but this group of Bedouins was a group that wandered around different places because they were nomads with their herds and their flocks. You've got those that settle to the land and dig in with agriculture and those that live in the city. But anyway, you've got this group of Ta'amira Bedouin people who came to the area northwest of the Dead Sea to water and to feed their flock. That was their occupation with goats. I think that they had a group of goats. That's about all that would survive out in an area like that. And they come to the area just northwest of the Dead Sea in order to find some new pasture. Let me see if I can, should have done it before. If I can find a map that can show you. This is one 700 BC. I'll be looking for another one. You can start with that one to give you some idea of where we're talking about. Well, that's probably all we're going to find. We're talking about thousands of years ago. A lot of good the map does for us, but it shows you where the Dead Sea is, and it will show you where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in relation to it. We're talking about this area right here. Here's Jericho. We mentioned Jericho with Origen and with Timothy the First, the Nestorian patriarch. So we're talking about, by the way, this whole area is composed of cliffs all the way down to just east of Tekoa. A lot of cliffs that overlook the Dead Sea. That's where they were found. And you've got a lot of little brooks. This is the big one here, but you've got a lot of small ones that are found in this area that go in and out between the caves and the caverns. But anyway, we're talking about this region right at the very northwest tip of the Dead Sea. Being a nomad people like this group of Bedouins were, they had to constantly travel in an arid climate like southern Palestine in order to find enough grass to feed enough water for the animals, for the goats to drink, so they're always moving around from one place to another. And in this particular group of Bedouins, there were 3 of them, by the way. They're part of a whole tribe, the Ta'amira Bedouin tribe. But there were 3 particular men that were involved, evidently, in the initial discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And one of them in particular, the youngest one of the group, was the adventurer of the group, who always liked to leave the work of feeding and watering the animals to his 2 comrades, and he always went searching for gold and silver and treasures in the fountain of youth. You know, he was this type. Adventurous, he always thought that these caves around the Dead Sea could probably hide gold cakes and coins and a lot of silver that had been deposited by people years and years ago that had never been found. And so he made it his practice to always go searching in these caves looking for gold and silver and different treasures. Here's a picture. You can see how desolate, how utterly desolate the region is. Up here at the very top, you're going to see the community of the group of people that evidently deposited the scrolls here. And here are the cliffs, and you probably won't be able to see it. You can see the cliffs, but you'll find caverns. There's a number of them throughout those cliffs where different things have been found. It's a good picture. That's why you might want to take a look at it. It's a good picture of what the area looks like and where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Well, you'd be coming back this way. So you're coming back westwardly in Palestine. You're talking about this right here? This is the community of the Essenes that we'll get to later on. This is the community of the group of people that evidently owned at one time what we now refer to as the Dead Sea Scrolls and deposited them for some particular reasons. Well, there's a story. Let me see if I can find it. I'll read you the story. It's a short story. Here's what happened. They got the goats. One of the goats strayed and searched for better pastures, and one of the Bedouins, the youngest one, looking for that goat, came upon a steep, rocky hillside, and looking up, chanced upon a small circular opening in the rock face. With pardonable curiosity, he looked in cautiously. You've got to make your way up there first. But could make out only a large, dark cavern. So he picked up a stone and threw it in, and heard something crack and something break. Nervously apprehensive at the unexpected result of his effort, he withdrew and returned later with a friend. Each made brave by the presence of the other, they wiggled through the small aperture into the cavern, and the dim light could distinguish some large jars standing on the floor, one of them broken by the recently thrown stone. Fragments of others were lying all around, but they quickly proceeded to examine the contents of the intact jars. Instead, however, of the expected golden treasure, they drew forth a number of leather or sheepskin rolls covered in, to them, an unknown writing. Had they but known it, a treasure far greater than any gold. As a matter of fact, I think back with this group of pictures, it shows how difficult it was to get to them. The only way these archaeologists could get to them was from the top and descending down, and you can see them hanging in midair. You can see the great cliffs, which would be on the opposite side of the Dead Sea. That's the cliffs you see in the background. The picture, in other words, is taken from the back of the cavern looking out. You can see them suspended in midair on these ropes coming down inside the cavern.
Can you go over there today and look at the cave?
No. Don't see the jars in here. I think I've got them somewhere else. A lot of interesting pictures there, but in another message. There's some ziggurats from Babylon. So anyway, they find at this time, the first time when they go in, 3 what appeared to be sheepskin rolls. And they sold these to a professor in Israel at the Hebrew University by the name of E. Sukinik, who was a very important, he's now dead. Shukenik, was a very important professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Evidently this was done in November or December, the very, very end of 1946. The story has been told so many times, and let me just tell you now, nobody knows for certain all the details or when these things were found. So you're going to read different dates from different people's writings, and there's no way to tell exactly who's right because the Bedouins have told us a lot of different tales. As a matter of fact, I think I got a picture of the Bedouins, the Ta Amira Bedouins. Here's the ones that discovered it. The one on your right is the youngest one, and he's the one that threw the stone in. You actually got a picture of the backward Bedouin that made such a famous discovery. I think that's his uncle or one of his older friends there. That was part of the group of 3 that were traveling that day. Here are a picture of the jars. Of course, they've been reconstructed now. He smashed them. That's a picture of what the jars look like. It's another picture of the area. Well, that gets into some other things about the Essene community. We'll discuss them probably in another class, but they had what they called a scriptatorium, where whole benches and work tables have been found where they did all of their copying of the manuscripts. But anyway, these were sold to E. Sukenik in 1946. Then in early 1947, this same group of Bedouins returns to this cave as well as some others, and they find 4 more that they sell to the Metropolitan Samuel, who's the leader of the Syrian Orthodox St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem. Metropolitan is an ecclesiastical title among the Orthodox Syrian Church. And speaking of one of their leaders, that's very high up. So they find these, and these are sold to Metropolitan Samuel. Metropolitan Samuel really doesn't know what to do with them. They pack them all in an old cigar box and pull a stone out of the damp floor of the old stone-built monastery, you know, where things can really decay in a hurry there. They had been kept in these jars out in the arid Qumran community where they're not going to decay out there. Sure enough, they began to decay almost immediately, and of course we lost some of them because of where they were stored by some of these people that weren't very knowledgeable. Because Samuel didn't know what to do, he took them to the ASOR, the American Schools of Oriental Research, that was established in Jerusalem at that time, that was headed by the author of this book, Miller Burroughs, B-U-R-R-O-W-S. Miller Burroughs, who was a friend of the Johns Hopkins professor William Foxwell Albright, had just happened to have taken a journey to Baghdad on business for the ASOR, the American Schools of Oriental Research, and had left Bill Greenlee in charge behind John C. Trevor. I've read this book a number of times. It's so fascinating. It gives the whole story. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a personal account by John C. Trevor. Trevor was the first knowledgeable person, as far as being an American archaeologist that we know of, to ever see the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was the one who made a comparison of it with the Nash Papyrus, at least some copies of the Nash Papyrus, and felt that he had found a remarkable discovery, and he's the one, John C. Trevor, who had written W.F. Albright. And Albright had written him back saying this is the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. So because Samuel didn't know what to do, he got in contact with Trevor over at the ASOR, and Trevor went over to St. Mark's Monastery, which is still in Jerusalem, by the way. St. Mark's Monastery is still there, and talked with the Metropolitan and was able to convince him to allow Trevor to take some of the scrolls, particularly the Great Isaiah scroll, back to the American School of Oriental Research so that they could photograph it. There's a long story about him trying to find film and Remember, you just about got the Jewish state created, and so there's a lot of war, a lot of battle, a lot of fighting going on, and bullets are ringing everywhere. It's like a mystery story. You ought to read the book if you don't have it. It's like a mystery story, but it's all true, and it has to do with the discovery of manuscripts that validate the Old Testament. And so whenever Burroughs gets back, of course, he's missed all of the great initial beginnings of the excitement over the discovery, but he gets in on it himself, and they're able to get a hold of all of these that have been sold to the Metropolitan Samuel and get photographs of them. 2 years later, in 1949, the Metropolitan Samuel came to the United States in an attempt to sell these 4 precious scrolls that had been found in this Dead Sea cave. But his $1 million asking price was a little too high for people just after World War II. I think Yale University took a good look at him and wanted it, but had just spent a lot of money on something else and couldn't afford it. And so he finally got desperate and ran an ad in the Wall Street Journal advertising famous Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, they weren't famous then. They weren't famous. I mean, if we knew what we know today, well, you would have paid $50 million to get your hands on it. So he ran an ad in the local New York newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, asking, does anybody want to buy some ancient scrolls? I've even got the article at home. It's amusing. When you look back from now on an ad in the Wall Street Journal, maybe you better get it and keep an eye. No. People get those things long before it ever makes it to Wall Street Journal nowadays. Why were people skeptical? Because they should have been skeptical, because the Bedouins made a practice and were very prosperous at it of giving forgeries, of selling forgeries to people all the time. And so it's very difficult to know when they had found something real and when they had spent some time on a rock while they were watching the goat writing it themselves, which they could make to look, just leave it out in the sun for a while, and it'd look pretty old after a while. Unless you knew what you were doing, and see, Albright did, and Trevor did, and Burroughs did, and Greenlee did. These men knew what they were doing, knew what they were saying, because it was their job to study things like this. Unless you know what's going on, you're not about to buy it. As a matter of fact, it had been offered for sale to other people. There was a Bethlehem antiquity dealer that dealt with these things a lot, and no one was going to touch it, because they just knew it had to be a forgery. No one's going to find a manuscript dated 100 B.C. That's 2,000 years ago. No one's going to find that. Someone forged it. And they're asking $1 million for it. Oh, there are a lot of interesting stories. They just come to my mind like a flood in my reading that I've done about all of that, and I don't want to get into, that deal with a lot of manuscripts that people have been taken for large sums of money. But anyway, I don't want to get off on that. Maybe we'll talk about that when we talk about archaeology more in depth. So no one buys them. He packs them back up and heads back to Palestine. Finally, in 1954, a lot had happened to those manuscripts since they were discovered in 47. They were bought by the son of Sukenik, who is now dead, Yigal Yadin, who was probably the most famous Jewish archaeologist of this century, who, from what I understand, just died recently. But the famous Israeli archaeologist, Yigal Yadin, bought them for the state of Israel for $250,000. Just a quarter of the price that he was asking to begin with. He bought them from Metropolitan Samuel in 1954. The oldest one of these was dated the 3rd century B.C. And many of the others were dated during the first 2 centuries before Christ. As I said, Trevor helped initially by comparing the scroll with a facsimile of the Nash Papyrus, which also was dated the 2nd century B.C., and you could determine by the way the letters were written, did that come from the same general time period? Obviously, letters, they changed a little bit as several hundred years went along. And as I've already said, Trevor's beliefs were confirmed by Albright, although many scholars then and many scholars today, a surprising number, not in the evangelical camp, but a surprising number today, still believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not genuine, that they were forged during the Middle Age period. And that's not uncommon to come across someone's writings about the Dead Sea Scrolls that tell us that they were forged during the Middle Ages. Not all of them have been published to this date. The work is still going on. After a long period of time, many decades, to get all of the material published. In all, 11 caves were discovered that contained important material between the years 1946 and 1956. Most of these, especially the ones we've been talking about, the 3 sheepskin rolls that were sold to Sukenik and the 4 other scrolls that were sold to Metropolitan Samuel, evidently had belonged to an ancient Jewish sect known as the Essenes, Essenes, who we'll discuss in another class, who lived at a community known as Khirbet Qumran, Khirbet, Khirbet Qumran, Qumran, also known as Wadi Qumran. And that's the little, what looks like a fortress in the picture I showed you a moment ago. That's the Qumran Essene community. Evidently they were deposited a couple of centuries before Christ due to some impending invasion or disaster. Evidently, in other words, they were being attacked by their enemies. They were completely destroyed because all trace of them was gone. The whole city was gone, and they had just now unearthed it back then. And because they were being attacked, they had to get their sacred library. They had lots of things besides biblical books. They were not a purely theistic Jewish group of people. They were a Jewish sect, I said, who believed a lot of different things that the Old Testament didn't teach. But one thing they did believe was the Old Testament. And so they had a whole library of manuscripts containing copies of the Old Testament as well as of other writings, such as those writings that would deal particularly with their own sect. And these they all hid in these caves. Let me give you the dates on when the caves were discovered. The first cave, we've already said, was discovered in 1946. Then the second one, through the 6th one, were all discovered in 1952. Then the 7th through the 10th, 1955. And the 11th in 1956. Now, it's the content. Well, not just the content. The history of the discovery is pretty interesting in itself of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's the content that's most interesting. In light of this Essene community, the Qumran group, and in light of the standardization of the Old Testament text by the Masoretes that was completed 10th, 11th century A.D. So it'll be the content of the scrolls that we start looking at next week. Which means we're stopping. Because I've got way too much to say to keep going. On the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls.